really hard to predict. And I don't want to say it's definitely going to be a bloodbath because, again, the forces of reaction, the Gulf monarchies are so much weaker.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am your host, Rory McElhone, joined by the other host, Robert Morris.
How's it going, Rory?
Things are going very well because I'm very excited. Do you know why?
Why are you excited, Rory?
With house prices the way they are, I'm thinking of moving to a wonderful place called The Line. It seems like it's going to be the future. It's the way cities are going to be now, and I'm very optimistic. So, have you heard much about this place?
Oh, yeah, of course. It's this miraculous place in a new city in Saudi Arabia called Neom. And there's going to be millions of people who live there, $1 trillion city. Everything's going to be the future. It's going to be amazing.
That's wonderful. Have you got any new news on it by any chance?
Yeah, no, I don't think that's actually going to happen. What we are going to talk about today is, I think, impending future for the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is, of course, at the heart of that I don't think enough people are talking about. I'm pretty convinced, Rory, that we're kind of on the cusp of a Arab Spring 2.0. I think that by the end of the decade, we are likely to see massive unrest in the Arab world. And I think more people should pay attention to that. In our last episode, we talked about the Houthis and the government of Yemen, which takes a particularly troubling approach to a number of issues in the region and has met with success after success after success. And I think we should recognize that if we don't start preparing for the Arab Spring and start preparing to receive those uprisings in a more positive way than we did the last time, I feel like the Houthis and elements like the Houthis are going to be the winners. And that's going to make for a much more hostile environment for Israel, the United States, and I mean, really a lot of people who depend on Middle East oil and gas. I feel like it's worth gaming that out a little bit. And that's what we're going to do today.
If this does happen, can you see it helping any of the countries that are still, incredibly horrendous situations from the first Arab Spring, say like Libya or Syria?
It's hard to say, Rory, just how those places will be impacted. A lot depends on how the United States reacts. And as we discussed a lot in our last episode, U.S.
could be Trump.
Yeah, could very well be Trump. U.S. reactions in the region over the past couple decades have been pretty uniformly bad. So, yeah, you could imagine a place not where Syria and Libya have a chance to heal, but a lot more of the region looks like Syria and Libya, which is pretty disturbing to think about. At this point, you've got Sudan, Libya, and Syria that are all in different variety, and Yemen as well, though Yemen is slightly more peaceful, are in various amounts of disarray, but it's entirely possible that by the end of the decade we could see Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq fall further into chaos. So I don't want to sound so negative about the prospect of a new Arab Spring, actually, because it is something that I'm rather positive about. I think that what we've seen in the region over the past decade specifically has been a tremendous misstep and a tremendous step towards reaction and the status quo before 2011 that has left the region as screwed up as it is. And I do think there is some virtue to shaking up things further, specifically shaking up the sponsor of Neom, of The Line, where I regret to inform you, Rory, you are probably not going to have a chance to live in The Line. Yeah, it's...
I'll just have to rent.
Yeah. Saudi Arabia, over the past 8 years, I suppose, since the advent of Mohammed bin Salman, has been on a tremendous public relations tour to talk about itself as the future. We're gonna build the future here. And I've honestly been surprised by how much MBS has managed to accomplish in terms of some reforms within Saudi Arabia. I do think there's been a real backing away from their traditional support for Islamic fundamentalism across the world. But I do think it's kind of a It's a sort of an ancien regime thing. If you look at
Too little, too late.
Yeah, if you look at the elites before the French Revolution, a lot of them were very interested in Enlightenment ideas and the future and this, that, and the other thing, and it did not save them. One aspect, of course, is these mega projects that he wants to build, NEOM being one of them. Recent news on the line was the elements of the Saudi government announcing, actually, it's not going to be 100 miles long. It might be a kilometer long by 2030. And then, of course, other parts of the Saudi government be like, no. It's going to be just as big and ginormous.
But the horrible thing is, weren't there people that were living in the desert that were forcefully removed to make room for this ludicrous thing? And now it's like, it was all for nothing.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think it's all for nothing. I mean, I think there are tens of thousands of people living in NEOM building these things. This is a historic model. There's also a King Abdullah technological city. So the last king, before King Salman, remember, I guess is not actually the king yet, he's just the crown prince, built a new city that was going to have a university and was going to have 1 million inhabitants and was going to this, that, and the other thing. I think it might have gotten the university, but maybe 10,000 people moved there before all the resources were moved off to the new next thing. I think King Abdullah Technical City has lost out a lot because a lot of those resources are now devoted to NEOM. So these sort of pharaoh projects are kind of repeated dynamics in the history of Saudi Arabia. But I kind of get the sense that this is NEOM's going to be the last, and it's not actually going to be built.
I think the United Arab Emirates do something similar, have similar mega projects that then maybe are scaled down.
Well,
there's one that springs to mind. Is it Masdar City was supposed to be this super eco-friendly city, and it's sort of toned down. It's more like
there was a profile on that recently.
An eco-block.
There's a profile on that recently, and it's not that these things don't happen at all. It's just that they end up being implemented at a fraction of the size that they are. The fact that NEOM is, I think it's on the others, it's in a largely uninhabited section of the country. That just leads me to believe that it's likely to be abandoned entirely.
Yeah, it's probably not very well populated for a reason.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of aspects of it that might be, I think the reasons are geopolitical. I think that the NEOM site is convenient to Egypt and Israel, and it's not the case in recent decades, but in the second half of the 20th century, Saudi Arabia had very tense relationships with both Egypt and Israel. Even though Egypt and Israel in the 20th century were more often enemies than not, Saudi Arabia was fighting with both of them. So that was sort of why there was no natural development there. And of course, NEOM is a move towards Israel politically, which is on one level is, oh gosh, that's kind of nice and kumbaya. But on another level is what makes me certain that the Saudi royal family is desperately out of touch with the wishes of the Saudi people and the Arab world more generally. So I feel like we haven't done a good job yet of connecting why these two things are so rigidly connected. The concept of an Arab Spring, something that happened in 2011, a democracy movement, and the Saudis. And I think this is because of an unacknowledged aspect, an unacknowledged very deep connection between Saudi Arabia and what happened to the Arab Spring. The conventional narrative of what happened to the Arab Spring is essentially some variety of the racist interpretation that Arabs can't handle democracy. See, we tried, everybody, they gave it a good, honest try, and we ended up with horrible civil wars and this, that, and the other thing. That is not at all what happened. What happened was horrible civil wars were imposed on Libya and Syria by outside actors. There were a number of plausible-looking democratic experiments, most chiefly in Tunisia and Egypt, but in a lot of other places as well. Monarchies like Jordan and Morocco had to make democratic concessions that they've since rolled back. Kuwait, I think, just in the past week, has shuttered its parliament. There was a real democratic movement in the Arab world that showed real successes, foremost Tunisia, which managed to hold on to a representative democratic system with changes of power for a full decade before it finally died out, essentially because it had no economic resources to continue because of the Libyan civil war that the U.S. had created. You don't need to go down that line. But basically, the reason why democracy was crushed throughout the Arab world is because Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates crushed it. Last episode, we discussed how they mismanaged the democratic transition in Yemen. On March 14th, 2011, Saudi Arabia and the UAE invaded Bahrain to squelch its democratic transition. The most important action by far has to be the crushing of the Egyptian revolution in 2013, July 2013.
But the Muslim Brotherhood are all terrorists, so it's good that they're gone.
Yes, that's it. That's a key point. And it's such an incredibly successful marketing by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The United States had a terrorist issue with Al-Qaeda because the United States and, Sunni radicalism of a certain kind, because probably not justly, but probably inevitably, because of historic U.S. Problems with Iran, sort of Shia, Hezbollah elements were added, and because of our affinity with Israel, we're very anti-Hamas, this, that, and the other thing. But that really did not need to extend to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a overarching ideological movement that, yes, the terrorists of Hamas do claim some affiliation with, but it is incredibly, it's like treating the Enlightenment as a political party that you can vote up or down in your next election. Does that make sense? It is
it's more like an ideology. It's not a, political party.
Exactly.
It's not an army.
It is a massive movement of ideas over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries in the Arab world. And that massive movement of ideas that has under it a variety of disparate ideologies was pushing towards democracy, was pushing towards the idea of Arab democracy. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Gulf monarchies, very wealthy Gulf monarchies, obviously hate the idea of democracy because they are monarchies.
Oh, absolutely.
They are absolutely absolute monarchs. Yes, Rory.
And they will probably get a bit of a French Revolution treatment. What do you think?
Oh, I don't know about the UAE. I think the UAE could figure out how to persist. I think that the United States will probably protect it, and that won't necessarily be disastrous. I think if the United States attempting to protect the Saudi royal family from what's coming would be disastrous.
Well, it's just a much larger country. It's much harder. You'd pick the easier of the two.
Exactly. And while I'm not saying necessarily the UAE deserves to survive, I think it is structured better and more likely to survive. Saudi Arabia and the UAE hate the Muslim Brotherhood so much, this Enlightenment-style intellectual movement that is pushing towards democracy. And they just did, it's one of the most unrecognized and most successful marketing ploys of the century so far, is that they just successfully made Muslim Brotherhood a scary, nasty brand.
Well, it's because it's got Muslim in the name.
It's got Muslim in the name. It's got Brotherhood in the name. And you just have to say that on CNN or cable news or Fox News and say, oh, Muslim Brotherhood. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, Muslim Brotherhood. I brought this anecdote up that there's one of the most horrific stories of the Yemeni civil war is that a bunch of U.S. mercenaries were killing Saudi-affiliated militia members that were anti-Houthi. U.S. mercenaries were killing them for the UAE and the UAE could do this, could convince these U.S. mercenaries who, don't necessarily want to go around killing Democrats, killing people who just want to, have democracies in their country. But all the UAE had to do to these special operators was say, they're affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They're like, okay, yeah, they're bad. Let's go murder them. And it just absolutely chilling how effective this has been. So yeah, we spent a decade wiping out democratic politicians in the Middle East. That's what happened to the Arab Spring. That's the connection between Saudi Arabia and the Arab Spring. My deep conviction that Saudi Arabia is going to fall by the end of the decade leads me to believe that all the regimes that they're propping up are also very likely to fall. Chiefly, of course, would be Sisi in Egypt, which is looking incredibly shaky. There's just these massive, massive news stories the UAE dedicating 7% of its GDP for this year to just writing a check to keep the Egyptian dictatorship going is something that happened. Stories were written about it, and nobody's talking about it. Like, it's incredible how shaky all this looks.
What do you think will be the catalyst for this second Arab Spring?
That is a really, really important question. I would say that as of 2023, September 2023, I would have made the argument, as famously Jake Sullivan did and got rather humiliated. This is the National Security Advisor for the Biden administration, saying the Middle East is more calm than it's been in decades. This is right. This is actually in the issue of Foreign Affairs from the Council of Foreign Relations that was published, was it on October 7th? But
wow.
The week of October 7th. And I would have actually kind of agreed with Jake Sullivan, not because the U.S. had done a good job managing things, but just simply out of fatigue with the horror of it all, fatigue with what had happened in Syria, what had happened in Yemen, and everyone's just going to sort of kick back into a kind of dictator's peace for a few years. I think that was a very plausible possibility until October 7th, until the immense pressures that the Hamas attack and the ensuing extermination campaign carried out by Israel have exerted on the region. Like, it is just, I think that's part of that UAE bailout after bailout after bailout after bailout after bailout for Egypt was just an indicator of just how close to spinning off the wheels everything is. The funniest catalyst for a new Arab Spring, for the fall of the Saudi royal family, Rory, would probably be either the Biden or the Trump administration getting exactly what they've wanted and what they've worked so hard for over the past, 8 years at this point. Both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, and whoever is in power in January of 2025, be it a Trump or Biden administration, will still be working really hard to get a Saudi normalization deal with Israel. And I think the funniest possible result, of course, considering that there would certainly be a lot of horror that would come in train, would be for the United States to finally get that normalization between the Saudi royal family and the government of Israel, and then that being the impetus that creates the fall of the Saudi royal family. We talked about Yemen in great detail in the last episode, and the main thing that undermines Saleh, well, a lot of things that undermine Saleh, but one of the main things was the perception that he was a pawn of the United States and by extension, Israel. For Saudi Arabia, the Saudi royal family, to explicitly sign a deal with the United States and Israel, I think that is very likely to be the point at which the Saudis rise, the region rises. And I think King Salman knows that. King Salman is the actual king of Saudi Arabia, who is in some advanced state of
dying
senility at this point. But the one thing that we can all say with confidence that he's been able to exert, that he's been able to keep MBS from doing, the Crown Prince, his son, is normalized ties with Israel. Maybe this isn't true, but the perception is that MBS really, really wants to normalize ties with Israel. He wants to get that done, and it's King Salman that's holding him back.
What's in it for him? Is it just, good money and good relations with America, or does he just get on really well with Israel?
I think there's certainly all of those things are true, but you can put a somewhat positive spin on it as well. I think MBS wants to move on a lot of fronts. It's also, he's Mr. Bonesaw. Let's never forget he's a savagely violent guy who's regularly decapitating.
He's still incredibly medieval prince in a lot of sense.
Yeah, he's regularly decapitating people for bad tweets. The Saudis with the bad tweets don't work for the Washington Post, so we don't hear about it so much. But bad dude. However, I think he legitimately sees himself, and so back to the Enlightenment again, as an enlightened despot, like along the lines of, was it Catherine the Great or Joseph II? This is a guy who wants to move his country forward, And it's possible that he sees the obsession with Israel as similar to the old Wahhabi orthodoxy that he's also trying to move his country forward from. So absolutely, there's a lot of craven, corruption-oriented reasons why he'd be so into normalization with Israel. But I think he legitimately just kind of wants to move on. And I think that's one of the great tragedies of, I think we've discussed before on this podcast. I think our reaction to October 7th was initially talking about how people were getting, frankly, bored of the cause of the Palestinians. If Israel's reaction hadn't been so outsized and so disgusting, I think it was a tremendous opportunity to push normalization forward. It was a tremendous opportunity. If they just sort of, lobbed a few bombs, only killed 10 times as many Palestinians as Israelis, and then sort of worked towards ceasefire, this, that, and the other thing, they could have a deal with Iran by now. Mm-hmm. Okay, probably not a deal with Iran, but it was this tremendous opportunity. I think there probably are, or were, that operative word, I think there were, before Israel's murder campaign, I think there were probably, not a lot, but like a significant chunk of the younger Arab public that was kind of like, Palestine? I mean, come on, Yeah. But, and MBS could be seen as part of that population. I think that Netanyahu has killed that instinct for another decade or two.
What way has the outrage manifested in Saudi Arabia?
I can't speak to that. I can't point to any real details as far as speaking out, though it's the only thing that we have. As I said, this is a country where you can get decapitated for bad tweets, which is fascinating because both stories are true. The Saudi youth are experiencing an efflorescence of liberation in terms of how they can interact with each other.
Compared to, say, young people 20 years ago in the region?
Yeah, they can go to movies, this, that, and the other thing, but you don't say a goddamn thing about the government. Still, of course, and that also indicates that, like, we're just not going to know. Like, we're just not going to, you're not going to see all kinds of premonitions of being like, oh gosh, people seem really unhappy in Saudi Arabia. It's just going to go from like, we love MBS, our dear leader, to explosion. Yes. What we have seen is the Saudi government. I think there's tensions within the Saudi government, within the Saudi foreign ministry, within MBS and other front-facing Saudi government figures. It's just like, how do we convey both to, the United States and Israel, like how we desperately would love to still be your friend, but this is really, 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 really screwing with us, what you're doing here. I feel like there's a lot of, and I've been guilty of this as well. Actually, this is what I tweeted on October 7th, and I think I was wrong about this. It was like, well, that's the end of the Abraham Accords, or what have you.
Not if you massively change how the Abraham Accords are finalized.
Well, yeah, if you change, well, that's what we've seen in recent weeks is the United States has tried to make this happen desperately by changing all kinds of things and leaving out all kinds of demands, and it still hasn't quite worked. So it's this incredible tension of Saudi desperation. The Saudis are, I think, that our clearest indication of how worried the Saudis are about the oil price, about how their public thinks about Gaza, about everything, is how desperate they are for this deal. So they're desperate for this deal, but at the same time, they are desperate to look like they're standing up for the Palestinians. So it's completely schizophrenic. The Saudi government is still having these talks with the U.S. and Israeli government about normalization, while other people in the foreign ministry are calling Israel genocidaires. That was not something that they'd done very much of. But then with the beginning of this Rafah movement, the Saudi foreign ministry used the word genocide. And it would be nice to believe that a country isn't going to sign a normalization deal with a country it is describing as genocidal. But I think that underestimates just how desperate Saudi Arabia is. And it's that desperation that gives me the best indication that they are on the way out the door.
But also with everything currently happening and oil prices are still a bit meh, would suggest it's even worse for Saudi Arabia, because that's obviously the only real way they make money.
Yeah. Yeah.
when you adjust oil prices for inflation throughout history. So I'll just give a brief wee synopsis to give an idea. So pretty much around $30 a barrel up until the oil crisis, so up until the 1970s. It peaks to about just under $140 a barrel. And then during the 80s to the 90s, it roughly stayed at around $40 a barrel. We then have another spike at about 160 at around 2008 financial crisis. And then, but from this decade, it's been roughly 60.
Yeah, that's a key point here that I think folks haven't quite realized, which is that inflation means that historic oil prices are very different from what they used to be. And the fact is that Saudi Arabia has been dealing with incredibly low oil prices now for a decade. There was a huge spike when Russia invaded Ukraine, and
Yes.
it was like $120 a barrel, which historically, so what the numbers you just gave there, Ray, are inflation adjusted. So historically, $120 a barrel is like, oh my God. But then if you look at that graph you were just talking about, $120 a barrel was normal oil prices from like 2009 to 2014.
A lot of the teens, it's around that price.
So when Saudi Arabia was doing the heavy lifting of repressing the Arab Spring, they had a ton of money to play with, and they were fire hosing it everywhere. Saudi Arabia and the UAE don't have that much money to play with. I mean, they're still wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice.
And buy up a lot of sports that you would have thought never would have went anywhere close such a country.
Yes. They're still doing that sort of thing, which is insane to me. But the UAE does not have the ability to spin 7% of its GDP into countries over and over again. So I think we are reaching very hard limits. I think what's important to know about Saudi Arabia right now is it's already taken a lot of the steps that it would need to take to become more financially responsible. They introduced a value-added tax. Famously, in 2017, I believe it was, MBS locked up the rest of the royal family and the rest of the rich people in Saudi Arabia in the Ritz-Carlton and started torturing them until they agreed to give up their sections of the wealth. So a lot of Saudi royal and elite wealth has already been consolidated. Over the course of the Biden administration, Saudi Arabia has really calmed down. They've done a lot less foreign adventuring. They've been desperately trying to get out of their Yemen quagmire for the past, really, honestly, 5 years at this point. They're already, it may not seem like it with all the sport, as you mentioned, the sports teams they buy and the mega cities they talk about, but Saudi Arabia's already been economizing pretty massively. They have debt again. They just didn't have any debt.
Wow.
In the period sort of 2009, 2014. They just paid off all their debt because why would they have debt? Now they have a national debt again. They are beginning to get more and more. They haven't killed the golden goose yet, but Saudi Aramco, the largest company in the world, which is pretty much the main source of Saudi government revenue, Saudi economy revenue, gives a dividend to the Saudi government every year. For the last number of years, that dividend has been jacked up and up and up and up and up. And they're taking more and more money out. They're putting less and less money into developing more sources or enriching the sources they have because perhaps they know that 5 to 10 years from now, they may not actually be there to benefit from it.
Well, it's also the worry that would be is, no one really truly knows how much oil they have left. Obviously, they'll say they have loads of oil, but I've heard people pointing out that they're doing more offshore extraction, which, anything, at deep sea over water is incredibly expensive. So if you had lots of lovely oil on land, why would you be spending so much offshore? So if they're spending at an incredible rate and then suddenly the oil starts to massively decline, we'll see Saudi Arabia collapse very quickly because there will be kind of a panic if people will be doing a run on Saudi Arabia and betting against them and all those horrible things.
Well, but actually that's a great strategy for
curtailing them.
No, prolonging Saudi Arabia, because if Saudi Arabia said all of a sudden, gee whiz, actually we're running out, and we we have to cut another 2 million a day, that actually might spike oil prices. So that might actually, that
Help
could
them.
be one of the strategies we see is that, well, actually, you know how everybody's been saying we're really running out of oil? We are. That might be another sign of desperation. Maybe that'll actually, because I know that people have, this has been
Oh, yeah.
since before there was an internet, people have been talking about how Saudi Arabia's lying about how much oil and gas they have. I haven't seen a ton of support for that. It's gotten a little more support because over the past 3 to 4 years, they've absolutely been limiting their production. But they're limiting their production because they desperately want the price to be higher. And I think, I don't know, I actually haven't looked into it, but in 2020, didn't they pretty much just open the taps and weren't they going absolutely crazy? So I feel like if they were able to just open the taps in 2020 and pump oil and drop the price down in the negative territory where it was briefly during COVID.
That was crazy.
That was absolutely crazy. And it does tend to undermine the theory that maybe they're running out of oil, but I don't know.
Yeah.
Couldn't tell you.
So is everything, is your theory on a second Arab Spring based on Saudi Arabia collapsing?
That's a great question. I think I've always seen a second Arab Spring as kind of inevitable. I compare it to the 1848 revolutions in Europe, which seemed like a disastrous failure initially, and then in retrospect, actually everything that they wanted kind of happened. I would say the fall of Saudi Arabia is a key part of that actually happening under scenarios that I envision in the short term. But in the long term, yes. I mean, because I don't believe Arabs are different. I believe that Arabs are people, and people want to govern. And people want to govern themselves.
And a lot of human history, the Arab world was the forefront of scientific understanding,
exactly,
and democracy. So yes,
exactly. There's nothing about Islam.
History can't repeat itself.
There's nothing about Islam. There's nothing about Arab ideology. Arabs as a people or a culture that makes it incompatible with democracy. Tunisia has shown that actually. Yes, some kind of second Arab Spring is inevitable. The most likely scenario for the next Arab Spring is some kind of collapse of Saudi Arabia, and the tensions introduced by both low oil prices and the added tensions of the war in Gaza make me believe that this kind of thing is imminent. I'm not saying it's necessarily in 2024 or 2025, but by 2030.
Okay, wow, incredible.
I think it is. I think it's happening.
Is this?
I'm doubling down here, Rory. I'm doubling down.
Is this something that could destroy Europe? Because it just sounds like this. If the way you talk about it is like the refugee crisis from the first part of this Arab Spring is just a warm-up act. Because if Saudi Arabia collapses, we're also going to have Egypt inevitably collapse as well, which has a massive population.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak. It's pretty bleak, which is, I guess, raises the question of like, what should the United States do here? And I think it's really important. And actually, I think Obama kind of did the right thing in 2011 in Egypt. He did the wrong thing in 2013. But in 2011 in Egypt, he was sort of like, well, Hosni Mubarak does kind of suck. Let's do a transition. Which was appalling to the Saudis, and because Hosni Mubarak was, of course...
they could see themselves in 20 years being treated exactly the same.
Or that month. That was a real concern. They spent hundreds of billions of dollars not to...
Was it really that close?
I mean, they spent a lot of money. $100 billion is what sticks in my head, but it was that year...
That's a lot of money.
That year, they firehoused out like $100 billion of benefits to the Saudi people. To essentially, which was not a luxury that any other Arab dictator had. So they were very concerned. But I think that was the right thing, and I think it's very important that when the Saudis begin to fall, that we not decide to South Vietnam it up or treat them like the government of Afghanistan as was for 20 years. I think it's really important that we just let it fall and let the Arabians decide what their next government is. Because if we decide to, I don't know, send in the U.S. troops and maintain MBS in Riyadh or something, it'll just get, that's how you get to all of North Africa and the Middle East looking like Syria.
Can you tell us more about this defensive pact America has been talking about? Basically, it's like a defensive pact that no country outside of NATO seems to get has been pushed. What's happening there?
This is the Abraham Accords framework that began under the Trump administration. This idea that we're going to get Israel to sign deals with some of the grossest governments on the planet. This is good for, I don't know, reasons. But the Biden administration figured out that apparently a lot of Israel supporters in the United States liked this idea. So their big white whale for 4 years now has been to get a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And Saudi Arabia, the king, Salman, we've already talked about, has no interest in signing this deal. MBS is interested, but he wants to be bribed. And the bribe that we are offering, very absurd comprehensive bribe, is, yes, an explicit, we can't do a treaty because it wouldn't make it through the Senate, but like a very explicit security guarantee for Saudi Arabia, which would be something on a NATO level, essentially saying that you're obligated to come in and help us. Theoretically, this would be pitched because, they're worried about Iranian invasion, when in reality, what it would be is you need to help come in and defend us from our own people. That's what this deal would be. So it's sort of an Article 5 sort of commitment to build a new South Vietnam in Saudi Arabia. And also, absolute insanity. I cannot believe that anybody had ever proposed this, and I do think there are enough sane people in the U.S. Congress that this would just not happen. A promise to allow Saudi Arabia to develop nuclear technology without the normal, I think they're called 123 agreements, without the requirements that we impose on everybody from UAE to South Korea if they want a nuclear plant. So essentially giving Saudi Arabia a freer reign with nuclear technology than we've given anybody in the world.
Incredible.
Which is these are the 9/11 people, for the love of God. You know, it is just, but that's the deal that the Biden administration has been pushing. The idea is we give Saudi Arabia all these things, and then Saudi Arabia agrees to have a normalization agreement with Israel. But the big stumbling block is that the Saudis are like, but we refuse to do this until and this has been a stumbling block throughout, until the Israelis make some kind of concessions around the Palestinians. And obviously, in the aftermath of October 7th, that has become a much more intensive and important concern. But as a sort of sign of desperation of the Saudi family, a couple of weeks back, we were talking about, to be clear, the United States never gets anything out of any of these deals other than expense and, well, much like NATO itself, actually, other than expense and commitments to get into wars that we don't need, which actually the United States government sees as a benefit, unfortunately.
Sadly.
But there's a new deal essentially saying that the Saudis are like, actually, we just want we're so desperate for a security deal that we don't even need Israel to be involved. Please give us a deal. And for some reason, the Biden administration...
What's the point of the deal if Israel isn't involved?
There is no point of the deal other than to save the Saudi royal family. Perhaps. And
why would you want a nuclear power plant in a part of the world where it might explode? Because if Yemen decides to do something bad to it?
These are all very valid concerns.
I know nuclear power plants are much safer, but it's still best not to have anything attack them.
Yeah, well, I think the UAE already has nuclear power plants, but the UAE had to go through this onerous Department of Energy process and sign these very in-depth agreements and agree to all these security protocols. We're apparently just going to be like, here, Saudi, have some uranium. Oh, you want some centrifuges? It's insane. But it's a thing that we're trying to do. And the fact the Biden administration was just like, we just need a security deal with Saudi Arabia, kind of indicates that perhaps the Biden administration, perhaps Washington, D.C., has a clearer vision of just how shaky the whole regional order is right now. And to be clear, I don't think it's a good case, but you can make a case for needing something you discussed already, for needing to preserve Saudi Arabia and Egypt as they are now, because otherwise
there'll just be floodgates.
There's just going to be a horde of refugees that are going to swamp Europe. You can make that case. I don't think it's a particularly good case.
Will it not just be like Libya, but on a much grander scale because we're dealing with such bigger wealth?
Yeah, well, yeah, but I think that as unfortunately Europe has learned a variety of coercive approaches to sort of keep the boats from coming. I think you'd probably see Europe just outright sinking boats that tried to come in this
It's
context.
terrifying.
So yeah, I don't think Europe would get swamped. I think
It would get very ugly.
it would get incredibly ugly very quickly.
How will this affect the likes of Turkey? A much more stable democratic country.
It's hard to say because unfortunately that stable democratic country is now also very reliant on Saudi Arabia and the UAE money. There's been repeated instances of this was sort of a lower level. This is what the Saudis and the UAE used to do with Egypt for a decade. Is they just what this means financially, I've never quite wrapped my head around. But they'll simply deposit money at the central bank of another country. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE have deposited tens of billions of dollars at the Turkish central bank, which helped the Turkish central bank maintain liquidity. I don't know what any of these words mean. So it potentially Saudi Arabia and the UAE falling, which would have absolutely been something that Erdogan would have celebrated 5-6 years ago, could actually be really problematic for Turkey as well. Famously, I mean, the only reason we ever knew Jamal Khashoggi's name is because the Turkish government chose to publish the surveillance they had of the Saudi embassy.
Yeah.
He could have literally just disappeared and been a weird, sad footnote. But it was actually the Turkish government that made it a big deal because in the context of the first Arab Spring, Turkey was very much on the side of Islamic democracy and opposed to the Saudis and the UAE, which is very interesting that in the United States, it was coded as this sinister thing that Turkey was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Yes, they were supporting Muslim democracy and against absolute monarchy, but it was somehow successfully coded in U.S. media as something sinister.
How can you see America making this much worse, as they often do?
I think I'd mentioned earlier, if we did actually sign this deal and decided it was somehow in the U.S. interest.
Oh yes, to protect Saudi Arabia,
to maintain MBS in power in a country where he's in the process of getting overthrown. And also, I mean, and of course, if we did that, then the Houthis might decide to intervene to help, in which case they'd probably start carving up Saudi Arabia, which is always a bad move. I'm a big fan. I think I've made clear in other podcasts. I'm a big fan of stable borders. I really don't like. I know the terrible imperialists made these borders, but they made these borders 150 years ago, and it's better to not.
You don't want them to get a bit wobbly or keep the straight line.
Yeah, just love them straight lines. Love them straight lines, for sure.
How long will this process take? Will it eventually bring out? Will it be a better process for these countries? Will they? Can you see Libya ending up better by 2040?
Well, yes, because you have to understand the key problem in Libya, and one of the key problems in Sudan, another place that's I think Sudan is substantially more horrific than Libya, frankly, both because of population numbers and because of the savagery of what's happening. Sudan, the nastier actor, they're both nasty actors, but the nastier actor in Sudan is being heavily funded by the United Arab Emirates. In Libya, Haftar, the spoiler for a decade now, the wannabe strongman who doesn't have the power necessary to be the strongman, has been primarily supported by Saudi Arabia and the UAE.
Okay.
So yeah, it's possible that just more chaos and destruction will be brought about, but it's also possible that
they find an equilibrium.
Yeah, with one less anti-democratic actor, because they are the most anti-democratic actors. That's not a controversial thing to say. They are absolute monarchies.
Yes, I'm looking at a World Democracy Index, and I think Saudi Arabia is getting a 2 out of 10.
Okay, that sounds about right. That's I assume North Korea level. Yeah. It is
authoritarian. They are absolutely anti-democratic.
Sweeping away that sort of Gulf monarchy influence, even if it's just Saudi Arabia that falls, can't, in the long term, key point, in the long term, it can't help but being good for the region, the world, humanity in general. In the short term, especially dependent on what the United States decides to do, it could get incredibly grim. And that is something to watch out for.
If you were advising Joe Biden, say, or Trump, what would you tell them to do? Like, because obviously theoretically, you don't want Saudi Arabia to collapse because it will be horrendous. Could you basically say, could you ease in democracy? Can you, be nicer? Or is it just Saudi Arabia wouldn't put up with that?
I feel like Saudi Arabia it's inevitable that there be some kind of break or juncture. And I think the most important thing for Joe Biden or Donald Trump is that when that juncture comes, to not step in, because there will be an incredible core, especially if the Saudi, and this is what the Saudis are hoping for, especially if the Saudi royal family signs some kind of deal with Israel, there will be this incredible chorus of, oh, you're leaving a vacuum. We need to step in. We need to save our allies. What about our credibility? And the most important thing for Joe Biden or Donald Trump to do in that circumstance is to ignore all that garbage and just let the Saudis fall. That was the right thing to do in Egypt. The wrong thing to do was allow the Saudis and the UAE to overthrow the first democratically elected president of Egypt. So yeah, I think the right thing to do for the Middle East would just, for the United States, would just be to step out. Honestly, I think the even better thing for us to do would be to facilitate this process. And the way that we can facilitate this process is actually by stepping back somewhere else. We should just get out of the crushing the oil industry business. We should step back away from Venezuela. We should step back away from Iran. We're actually doing a pretty good job, actually, of not enforcing sanctions against Iran since Russia invaded Ukraine. It's sort of been the secret weapon keeping oil prices down. As we just sort of stopped enforcing sanctions against Iran. I think we should continue to not enforce sanctions against Iran. We should.
So are sanctions still on Iran? They're just being a bit sort of ignored?
Yes.
Is that what you're
they're
claiming?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So this is an open. It's not a secret. Malaysia is exporting something like I don't know if it's double or 5 times as much oil as Malaysia produces to China. And everybody knows that mystery Malaysian oil is Iranian. The Biden administration has refrained thus far from telling Malaysia, cut it out, or we're going to do XYZ consequences. So we should continue to do that. We shouldn't sanction Iran anyway, but that's obviously not changing. But what we could change immediately, which would be great for the U.S. border, would be great, again, for humanity, is just lift all sanctions on Venezuela and allow people to buy Venezuelan oil again, allow people to start pumping oil out of Venezuela again. That won't have it will have actually immediate effects, but in the longer term, in the 2 or 3 years, you get Venezuela back up to, they'll never be selling 3 million barrels of oil a day again, but they'll get back up to 1 or 2, and that will accelerate this process of oil prices continuing to be way too low for the Saudi royal family to survive. That would be a good next step. Unfortunately, I think the U.S. government is now pretty invested in higher oil prices, which is, I suppose, a different sad story.
So are you saying possibly good news for 20 years down the road, but will this make the first Arab Spring look quite small in comparison bloodshed-wise?
That's a great question.
Because it feels almost like what you're saying is like the first Arab Spring's dammed up, it's got so far, and this would then break the dam and finish it off, but in a horrific bloodshed to then bring about stabilization in a decade or two.
I mean, it's hard to predict. The thing is, what made the wars in the Arab Spring so bloody and so horrific was the fact that the powers of counter-revolution were so strong in 2011. Now they are incredibly weak. They just don't have the money. They don't have the forces. They're not as powerful as they were in 2011 and 2014. So it's entirely possible that things will be a lot more straightforward. I mean, we have a lot of real experience. I mean, you could imagine a really positive set of developments in Tunisia and Algeria. Both of those countries are fairly stable, could get back to democracy fairly straightforwardly. Libya is more complicated. Egypt's going to be infinitely more complicated. But, it's really hard to predict. And I don't want to say it's definitely going to be a bloodbath because, again, the forces of reaction, the Gulf monarchies are so much weaker. And the United States perhaps, might have learned a bit, unlikely, but might have learned a bit and realized that actually outsourcing our policy to the Gulf monarchs is not, in fact, the right choice.
Well, on that cheery note, we'll catch you next time. Thank you for listening. The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.